Welcome to this segment from the Europe's Innovation Gap: Why the EU Trails the US and East Asia in Tech series. To make this deep dive more accessible, I've broken the full video into smaller, focused chapters. If you're interested in the full story, from overregulation to the rise of unicorn startups, you can find the complete video on my channel. Today, we are talking about Chapter 2, Centralized Funding. Europe spends billions on R&D, but is its top-down funding model actually helping innovation? Let's find out.
Centralized funding, big grants, bureaucracy, and weak private investment.
If Silicon Valley is fueled by venture capitalists and daring entrepreneurs, Europe's innovation engine has long been fueled by governments and central programs. The EU and its member states pour billions into research via grants, public labs, and subsidies. On paper, public R&D spending in Europe is robust, roughly on par with the US as a share of GDP. But here's the rub. Private sector R&D and investment in Europe lags far behind. According to OECD data, businesses in the EU spend only about 1.2% of GDP on R&D versus 2.3% in the US. This is the key transatlantic difference. European governments spend a similar share to the US government on research, around 0.7% of GDP each. But Europe's companies underinvest in innovation. American and Asian firms plow profits into ambitious R&D projects. Think Google's moonshots or Samsung's semiconductor research. While many European firms stick to incremental improvements or rely on state-funded projects. The graph you see shows R&D investment in the tech sector, circa 2020, US versus EU versus China, per European Commission data. Europe, centre, invested dramatically less than both the United States, left, and China, right, in tech R&D. The left bubble, about $200 billion, shows North America's tech R&D spending in 2020, utterly dwarfing the EU's roughly $40 billion middle. China, right, around $64 billion, had already overtaken Europe and was growing circa 15% per year. This visual underscores how Europe's private R&D effort in tech is just a fraction of its rivals. This imbalance stems in part from Europe's funding structures. The EU tends to favour top-down programs. Think of massive grant schemes like Horizon Europe, a $95 billion science program, or the EIC Pathfinder, funding cutting-edge tech startups. These are laudable initiatives, but they're often centralised, slow, and bureaucratic. By the time a European research consortium wins a Horizon grant, a Silicon Valley startup might have already raised venture money and brought a product to market. As the Draghi report observed, European public R&D investment is dispersed, lacks focus, and its management is excessively bureaucratic. Funds are fragmented across national and EU levels. Only about 10% of public R&D investment happens at the EU continental level, via programs like Horizon, while 90% is by individual countries with inadequate coordination. This can lead to redundancy, slower decision-making, and projects that align with political compromises rather than a bold, singular vision. By contrast, the US federal system concentrates large bets in agencies like DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or through coordinated missions, such as the moon landing, the recent CHIPS Act for semiconductors. China, even more directly, channels resources into strategic tech sectors via its centralized plans, Made in China 2025, etc. Europe's approach can feel like 27 cooks trying to stir one pot, each adding their own ingredients. The outcome is a diluted stew rather than a sharp, spicy dish. Crucially, Europe's heavy public spending hasn't crowded in enough private investment. In fact, some argue it might crowd it out. Companies become comfortable relying on government support for R&D rather than taking risky bets with shareholder money. The European innovation model skews academic too. Universities and research institutes deliver strong scientific output. Europe actually leads the world in scientific publications, but there's a mismatch in commercialization. Those great lab results aren't translating into startups, products and profits at the same rate as in the US or Asia. One reason cited is the limited integration of Europe's researchers with the private sector and investors, silos between academia and industry. Even where Europe tries to emulate the startup funding model, through public venture funds or innovation competitions, the grant-based mentality can impose strict rules and paperwork that slow the pace. Entrepreneurs have to become experts in EU grant writing or navigate multiple national innovation agencies. This centralised, grant-heavy system lacks the agility of private venture ecosystems. Case study: the Horizon Europe program is enormous, yet many participants complain of its complexity. Winning a grant can require consortiums of entities from multiple countries, months of proposal writing, and review by committee. Valuable, but not exactly lean or fast. Similarly, the EIC, European Innovation Council Accelerator, offers equity investments to startups, but it's essentially the government picking winners, which can be hit or miss. Meanwhile, in the US, a company like SpaceX secured early NASA contracts, but also billions in private VC. In China, companies like Alibaba grew largely on private capital with government guidance in the background. Europe's startups often rely on public grants as lifelines where others would use venture capital. The result of all this? Underpowered private investment. The European Commission itself admits that Europe's total R&D is below target. The EU has long aimed for 3% of GDP on R&D, but sits around 2.2%. And that the main differences are in levels of private investment, with public investment being more even between the EU and rivals. In fact, by 2021, the EU's R&D intensity was just 2.16% of GDP versus 3.46% in the US, 3.30% in Japan, and a whopping 4.93% in South Korea. South Korea and Israel now invest over 4% of GDP each in R&D, double Europe's rate, largely driven by tech companies in those countries. Europe simply isn't matching the private R&D firepower of a Samsung, IBM, or Huawei. To illustrate the private sector gap, consider the world's top tech R&D spenders, companies investing the most in research. The list is dominated by American and Asian firms like Alphabet, Google's parent, Microsoft, Huawei, Samsung, Apple, and Amazon. Very few European companies appear in the top ranks. In fact, among the top 15 global tech R&D investors in recent years, only one or two, like Germany's Volkswagen or SAP, are European, and they lag far behind the leaders. In this chart, European Commission data 2019, each bar is a company's annual R&D spending in millions of euros. Red bars represent US companies, yellow, Chinese, and blue, European. The giants on the left, Alphabet, Microsoft, Huawei, Samsung, Apple, Facebook, etc., invest tens of billions yearly. Only a couple of blue bars, like SAP, Nokia, even appear, and they are much shorter, highlighting Europe's scarcity of big private R&D spenders. This imbalance in corporate R&D muscle is a major reason the EU falls behind in innovation. Furthermore, European industries tend to invest in what they have long been good at: automotive, machinery, pharma, which are important but often mid-tech or mature sectors. Meanwhile, the US poured money into successive waves of high-tech, like software, internet, biotech, now AI, and Asia, especially China, into hardware and electronics. As one study noted, 85% of US business R&D is in high-tech fields like software, IT, biotech, whereas 50% of EU business R&D is in mid-tech like automobiles. Europe is great at engineering improvements in cars or advanced manufacturing, but it missed the boat on newer digital industries. This path dependency, sticking to the beaten path, is dubbed a middle technology trap by economists. Without disruptive innovation, Europe risks staying an industrial powerhouse but a digital lightweight. To summarize, Europe relies heavily on public funding and centralised programs for innovation, while its private sector plays a smaller role than in the US or Asia. Government support is vital, but it hasn't catalysed a self-sustaining innovation ecosystem. As a consequence, when Europe spends €1 on R&D, it often yields less commercial impact than $1 spent in the US, because that $1 likely came from a market-driven decision with potential for high growth. If you found this chapter interesting, consider watching the full deep dive, where I cover everything from Europe's startup gap to case studies comparing the EU, US, and Asia. You'll find the link in the description. And hey, if you like this kind of content, smash that like button, subscribe for more deep dives, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Cheers, and see you in the next one.